They say that some absences are so old that they seem to have been carved into the very wood of the houses where they occurred. Before continuing, the narrator leaves a simple, almost whispered sentence hanging in the air, which does not break the silence. Tell us which city you are watching from, and what time it is there now. After that, everything returns to the atmosphere of a historical archive. The case of the Cold Peak Sisters, recorded in the fragmented archives of Lawrence County, Missouri, has always appeared as a shadow between the pages, a discrete rural event, but one that, over the decades, has taken on the weight of an unsolved mystery. The documents consulted, reports from local authorities, letters from residents, notes from defunct newspapers, converge on a single certain point. Between May and August 1901, 41 men disappeared in the vicinity of the trail that ran alongside the Ozark River Trail, and all roads in one way or another led to the same place, the isolated property known as Cold Peak Homestead. The hill where the house stood was one of the quietest in the region. There was little wind there, even in late spring, and the neighbors, who lived more than 2 miles away, used to say that the air at Cold Peak always seemed heavier, not because of mistrust, but because of the geography itself. The light-colored wooden house had been built in the 1860s by Elijah Marrow, a stern patriarch whose descendants would follow that land with almost ritualistic obedience. When Elijah died, the farm was left in the care of his 4 granddaughters, whom the community, for simplicity's sake, came to call the Sisters. Records describe the 4 with a mixture of precision and silence. Abigail, the eldest, was about 42 years old and was only seen when she needed to buy salt, kerosene, or fabric. She was thin, rigid, spoke little, and always carried a narrow notebook. Martha, 38, was the one who dealt with the cattle, and many remember the direct way she held her gaze, something rare for a woman of that time. Clara, 33, took care of the vegetable garden and was the only one who, it seems, smiled during brief encounters with travelers. And then there was Elsie, the 15-year-old teenager, described in testimonies as pale, observant, and restless, almost always standing near the fence, as if waiting for something that no one could define. The community accepted the existence of the Cold Peak Sisters as naturally as it accepted the long winters. They were there, they had always been there, and they were unlikely to change. Their relationship with the residents was distant, but not hostile. They paid their bills, fulfilled agricultural exchanges and favors, and never got involved in conflicts. Perhaps for this reason, and only for this reason, their names were not immediately associated with the first disappearances on the trail. But documents show that the first official disappearance in 1901 occurred less than 800 meters from the northern fence of the Cold Peak Sisters. An experienced hunter, Thomas Holt, left in the afternoon to check traps and never returned. His left boot was found 5 days later, partially buried in a depression in the ground, indicating that someone, or he himself, had tried to erase it. In the months that followed, the trail seemed to swallow men without a trace. Blacksmiths, lone travelers, 2 Wagoner brothers, a Baptist pastor on a missionary visit, 3 young men heading for Arkansas. No clear pattern linked these men other than their final destination on the trail near the sisters' property. And it was only when the local patrol visited Cold Peak Homestead in August of that year that a disturbing detail was first recorded. In the house maintenance books, old hardcover volumes where Abigail wrote down everything from weekly flour consumption to the number of boards replaced in the barn, there was a sequence of carefully torn pages. The gap dated precisely to the month of May, when the first man had disappeared. Apparently, there was nothing more to say. But at the bottom of the last page before the gap, a small passage remained intact, written in firm handwriting. Prepare the chamber before the next return. The file ends there, and it is precisely in this silence that the darkest part of the case begins. In the months leading up to the mass disappearance, the routine at Cold Peak Homestead seemed, at first glance, as predictable as the course of the river below, meandering slowly among the trees. County records describe a property that functioned almost like a closed organism. Everything that came in and out was noted by Abigail, from sacks of corn to the approximate time a wagon passed by on the dirt road. Early in the morning, before the sun beat back the low fog that covered the valley, it was possible to see, according to some neighbors' testimonies, the silhouette of Martha already in the field, driving the cattle with firm steps. She spoke little to the men who sometimes crossed the trail, asking for water or directions. She responded without hostility, but without sympathy. Her sunburned face and hair, always tied under a dark scarf, gave the impression of someone who had learned early on that the best way to avoid trouble was not to linger in conversation. Clara, on the other hand, seemed to be the only warm spot there. There were reports from travelers who remembered her with a kind of distant tenderness. They spoke of a woman with a soft voice, hands stained with dirt, offering a glass of fresh water or a piece of bread to those who approached the fence. She smiled, but always seemed tired, wrote a traveling salesman in a letter found years later among forgotten papers in a relative's house. This contrast, a brief smile amid such a harsh setting, was one of the details that most caught the attention of the researcher who, decades later, would revisit that case. At the silent center of this small universe was Elsie, the youngest. The few descriptions converge on the same image, that of a teenager who rarely left the property, always watching the movement on the trail with a curiosity that was not openly welcome. She had a way of looking at people that made them feel heavy, as if they were being measured, noted a farmer in 1903, recalling his last visit there. That comment would only gain real weight when it was found that almost all of the missing persons from 1901 had been seen at some point talking to one of the sisters, or being watched by Elsie from a distance. The house itself was simple, but it had its peculiarities. Downstairs, according to the inventory made after a partial inspection, there was a narrower room with reinforced walls and no windows facing the road. It was called, within the family, the compromise room. In the few accounts in which it appears, this room is described as a space where the patriarch Elijah, still alive, used to settle land disputes and work agreements. There is no formal evidence of illegal practices there, but the name, translated years later in documents as binding chamber, stuck to the case like a shadow, even though, for many, it was nothing more than a room where debts, fence boundaries, and seasonal arrangements were discussed. Before 1901, there is nothing in the records to indicate open conflict between the Cold Peak sisters and the men who crossed the trail. On the contrary, there are notes that in years of harsh winter, some travelers took shelter in the barn for a night in exchange for small services, such as repairing a wagon wheel or helping to reinforce the fence. The sisters seemed to understand the logic of rural life. Sometimes it was necessary to accept the presence of strangers in order to keep the work flowing. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place compared to other isolated properties in the region. What is striking, however, is the sudden change in pattern that begins to appear in Abigail's notes in the spring of 1901. For a period of 3 weeks, there are repeated mentions of visits by single men to the property. She does not record names, only numbers. Man 1, man 2, 2 men, light wagon, man with white horse. On 2 of these days, there is a discreet observation next to the main note, received in the appointment room. There are no additional details. No note about payment, no comment about services rendered. At the same time, vague memories of a change in the sisters' behavior begin to appear in later statements by residents. A neighboring farmer, interviewed in 1932, already elderly, spoke of a feeling that was difficult to describe. Before, when I passed by, I saw a busy, lively house. After May 1901, it seemed that everything inside was functioning, but as if out of obligation, as if they had decided something that no one else knew about. Daily life at Cold Peak continued, at least in appearance. Milk was delivered to a local middleman, smaller harvests were exchanged for groceries in town, and the sisters attended the nearest church from time to time, although they always stayed in the back, side by side, with closed expressions. However, a series of small details began to attract the attention of those who crossed their path. One of the most frequently mentioned signs in different records was the recurring use of dark fabric bands on the wrists of the older sisters. For some, it was just a way to reinforce the worn sleeves of their dresses. For others, especially men who had briefly been in the binding chamber to settle small debts, it had another meaning. They seemed to adjust the bands before any serious conversation, as if it were a ritual gesture marking the beginning of something formal, an agreement, a decision. No concrete evidence connects this detail to the disappearances, but the gesture is repeated so often in the reports that it has become an inseparable part of the imagery surrounding the Cold Peak Sisters. Meanwhile, the river trail remained active. 1901 was a year of intense movement, with rumors of job opportunities further south. Many men, some too young to have established families, crossed those paths with little luggage and in great haste. Some stopped only to ask for directions, others to rest their horses, fill their canteens, or find out if there were any safe shortcuts. It is in these brief encounters, described in letters and memoirs, that the sisters always appear as a fixed and silent point in the middle of the flow. And yet, a subtle unease begins to seep into the testimonies. A tool salesman, in an account recorded much later, mentioned something almost trivial, but which will be repeated with variations in other testimonies. They asked few questions. But when a man said he was traveling alone, Abigail's gaze would change, as if she had just noted down important information that was not spoken aloud. In another letter, written by one of the last men to be officially seen in the region before disappearing, there is a description that, at the time, meant nothing. He says that he was greeted by Clara at the fence, that he drank fresh water, that he heard a soft voice coming from inside the house, perhaps Martha's or Abigail's, saying something like, "If he's coming back along the trail, maybe he can stop by again in the afternoon." The letter ends on a light-hearted note, as if it were just a kind gesture. What no one realized at the time was that, when crossing the trail for the second time, almost always at the end of the day, some of these men were seen approaching the property, perhaps in search of shelter, perhaps to finish a conversation hastily begun in the morning. What happened between these second visits, inside the binding chamber, and the moment these men were no longer seen, remains, even today, covered by a layer of silence that the documents have never been able to completely penetrate. Abigail's last complete note before the pages were torn out speaks only of adjustments to the house and preparation for the next arrivals. Just below, in smaller letters, almost as if it had been written in a hurry, there is a sentence that would only make sense years later, when the number of missing persons was finally closed at 41. Nothing is permanent until agreed upon within the right walls. It was as if the entire house, little by little, was organizing itself for something that no one outside that property had been invited to understand. When investigators reconstructed the sequence of events in 1901 decades later, they realized that no disappearance occurred abruptly. There were no screams, no signs of struggle, no gunshots echoing through the valley. The men simply never returned. And by following the dust trails, the dates on the letters and the marks in the county records, it became possible to see an almost imperceptible pattern. Most of the absences occurred at dusk, always between 4 and 7 p.m. And when the light in the region became golden and diffuse, and the shadows of the forest began to lengthen toward the Cold Peak Sisters' fence. The day most investigated was July 27, 1901, as it was the one with the highest number of cross-referenced reports. Sources vary, but 3 witnesses claim to have seen 3 different men cross the trail that afternoon. A natural medicine salesman, a 17-year-old boy looking for seasonal work, and a sunburnt farmer riding a tired red horse. Each of them was seen at different times, slowing down near the sisters' property, sometimes to get water, sometimes to ask for information, sometimes just to rest. The heat was described as thick, and the air was dry enough to dust the gaps between the fence boards. On the horizon, a low cloud heralded an approaching change in the weather, although no records mention rain at that time. The trail, so well traveled, had recent wheel marks, and it is likely that the medicine seller was the first to reach the fence. He would have talked to Clara, according to a statement decades later, asking for information about a shortcut to the south. Clara, as always, would have offered him water. But what stands out in the statements is the detail that is repeated. She asked him to wait a moment because she needed to confirm something with Abigail. And in that brief interval, a period that may not have lasted more than 3 minutes, different witnesses claimed to have seen the back door of the house open. The figure that appeared there was neither Abigail nor Martha. It was Elsie. The teenager stood still, motionless, leaning against the doorframe, watching the scene as if she were witnessing something rehearsed. Some historians argue that this description may be the result of distorted memory, reconstructed by the imagination. But others point out that 3 independent sources mention the same image. Elsie standing still, looking at the man as if evaluating not the person, but the decision that is about to be made. From there, the narratives diverge, but they all agree on one thing. The salesman never reached his next destination on the trail, and his wagon, found 2 days later, was too tidy. No broken boxes, no damaged wheels, no signs of escape, as if he had voluntarily gotten out and continued on foot, but never resumed his journey. The second man who disappeared that afternoon, the young man looking for work, was seen by a family who lived near the trail junction. They remember him walking quickly, perhaps trying to reach the river before dark. The most disturbing detail, however, is that the same family heard, about 40 minutes later, a distant metallic sound coming from the direction of the Cold Peak sisters' house. It wasn't a gunshot. It wasn't a wagon. It was something more hollow, slower, like the dragging of a heavy chain across a wooden surface. This sound reappears in other testimonies, always described in a similar way, always associated with the late afternoon. Some residents believed it was just a reinforced door being locked. Others thought it might be something in the barn. But the sound was always the same, metallic, restrained, as if it were part of an old mechanism used rarely, but used with precision. The third and last man seen that afternoon, the farmer riding the red horse, left a more concrete trail. The day after his disappearance, the animal was found loose, grazing 50 meters from the north fence. The saddle had been removed and carefully placed on a smooth rock, the kind of arrangement a rider would only make if he was sure he would return in a few minutes. He never returned. As investigators progressed with their interviews, a psychological pattern began to emerge. All the men who had disappeared that season had been in some way welcomed, observed, or briefly guided by one of the sisters, but that in itself proved nothing. Houses along trails had always served as landmarks. Isolated families had always been sought out by thirsty travelers. Quick exchanges were common. What made this pattern disturbing were the conflicting statements about the interior of the house. 3 men who survived because they changed course, because they turned back, or because they simply refused to enter, reported the same detail, with different words, but with the same weight. The binding chamber had marks on the door jambs that did not appear to be the result of agricultural use or natural wear and tear. One of them described the marks as 2 deep parallel lines made by something heavy that was dragged in the same direction. Another said he saw the outline of something square, as if a structure had been removed or replaced several times. A third said only that the wood looked like it had been pressed from the inside out, as if it had been subjected to some kind of force. These reports, however, were only documented years later, too late for any thorough inspection of the site. When investigators finally examined the house in 1904, the binding chamber had already been emptied. There were no marks, no structures, no objects that could indicate a specific function. But the most disturbing record of that room did not come from a man. It came from a woman. In 1921, a retired nurse claimed that as a child she had gone to the sister's house with her mother to fetch medicinal herbs. In this belated testimony, she describes the binding chamber as smelling of cold iron even in the heat of summer. The description seems simple, but modern historians agree that, if true, this odor would hardly come from common agricultural tools, especially since the room had no windows facing the stable. The tense atmosphere is recreated in the investigation of the last confirmed steps of the missing persons. Almost all the men seen that afternoon of July 27th passed through the same points: the narrow stretch of the trail where the fence curved, the shallow well where Clara offered water, the shade of the porch where, in some testimonies, Abigail watched silently. the side door, where Elsie appeared only once, but at the exact moment. At night, around 8 o'clock, a significant phenomenon occurred. A family nearly 4 kilometers away reported seeing a single lantern crossing the sisters' yard, moving slowly toward the barn. The lantern went out quickly, but this brief glow was mentioned so many times by so many subsequent witnesses that it entered the official dossier as the last flash. What happened after that is the most difficult part to reconstruct, not for lack of reports, but because of their excess. Some say they heard a wagon in the early hours of the morning. Others claim to have heard running footsteps, followed by abrupt silence. Some speak of muffled voices or the sound of wood creaking under uneven weight. And yet, the detail that most impressed the researcher responsible for reopening the case in 1938 came not from a statement, but from an object. A narrow strip of dark fabric found stuck to a branch a few meters from the side door of the house. Analysis at the time determined that the fabric was similar to that used by the sisters on their cuffs, hand-sewn reinforcements. The branch where the fabric was stuck was bent downward, as if something had passed by quickly or with enough force to tear it off. This small fragment would become one of the last pieces of physical evidence linked to that night. At the end of his preliminary report, the investigator wrote a sentence that still resonates with unease today. If 41 men entered that trail that summer, then at least once, something, or someone, had to leave it. The investigation would reach its peak when 2 days after the triple disappearance, the county sheriff visited the property and found the house exactly as it had always been. Clean, tidy, silent. But the door to the binding chamber was ajar. And inside, on the cold wooden floor, was a single object that did not appear on any inventory. A small iron key, still damp, as if it had been washed a few minutes earlier. What it opened, or closed, was never found. The sheriff's visit to Cold Peak Homestead, 2 days after the disappearance of the salesman, the boy and the farmer, was recorded in an unusual way in the official files. Not because of what he found, but because of what he didn't find. The report, partially preserved to this day, describes the house as in order, with the smell of fresh wood, and no signs of disorder. It was a common observation in rural inspections, but it became intriguing because of the almost rehearsed precision that marked each room. The sisters were seen together on the porch, lined up as usual. Abigail spoke on behalf of the 4. She said they had not received any visitors in those days, except for a tired man who asked for water and moved on. The answer was neutral, sober, without hesitation, and according to the sheriff, too rehearsed for someone who lived in isolation. He mentioned this in a personal note, noting that her tone seemed more administrative than rural. When the sheriff finally mentioned the binding chamber, Abigail simply replied that the room was used to store old objects, and that because of the heat, they had left the door open for ventilation. At that point, none of the missing men had been officially declared as such. They were just late, which was common for those traveling on long trails. Therefore, the sheriff could not, at that time, proceed with a thorough search. Still, the report points out a detail that went unnoticed at the time. The floor of the binding chamber was cooler than the rest of the house, even with the door open and the afternoon light partially entering. There is no clear explanation for this in the documents. Wood absorbs heat evenly, but the researcher who revisited the case years later believed that there was some kind of reinforced internal floor, perhaps a stone slab, to prevent moisture. However, no subsequent inspection found any similar structure. As if, between 1901 and 1904, something had been discreetly and completely removed. In the days following the sheriff's visit, 6 more men failed to reach their destinations. The community experienced what the newspapers called, at the time, a tide of absence. The expression appears at least 3 times in the Lawrence County Ledger. The county is experiencing a tide of absence. Families wait, but the absences accumulate. The tide of absence makes every trail a risk. The atmosphere became tense. The men of the region began to travel in pairs. Women locked doors that had previously remained open. And, for the first time since reaching adulthood, the Cold Peak sisters were the subject of hushed conversations in town. Some said the sisters owed money. Others suggested that Elijah, the patriarch who had died years earlier, had left behind an unresolved land dispute, and that unsuspecting travelers might have been unwittingly involved. There was also the possibility of conflicts with hunters from neighboring counties. None of these versions, however, had been proven. But some clues, albeit fragile, began to emerge. A wagon driver claimed to have seen Elsie alone in the woods at dusk, walking parallel to the trail. He said the girl was carrying what appeared to be a small wooden box. The testimony was given 20 years later and may have been distorted, but it reinforced the feeling that the youngest of the sisters was involved in tasks that no one else witnessed directly. Another, more solid account came from a local blacksmith. 2 weeks before the peak of the disappearances, Abigail had asked him to reinforce 3 heavy hinges, claiming they belonged to the barn. He found the piece strange. It was more suitable for extremely sturdy interior doors than for stable structures, but accepted payment in exchange for silence. These reinforcements were never found in subsequent inspections. Meanwhile, families of travelers began arriving in the county in search of answers. In letters preserved in state archives, mothers, sisters, and fiancés described the same anguish. Men who never missed appointments were days late. Regular letters stopped arriving, horses returned alone, carrying intact saddles. Public pressure mounted, and a second official inspection was authorized in August 1901. This time, 3 representatives from the local church and 2 sheriff's deputies accompanied the team. The sisters were again on the porch, lined up, serene. The house, once again, was impeccable, but something was different. On the outside wall of the binding chamber, someone had hung a damp cloth to dry. The cloth was dark, small, and appeared to have been washed a few hours earlier. The inspection men noticed the detail, but there was no legal justification to insist. The Cold Peak sisters offered simple, objective answers, and most importantly, they were consistent with each other. Every word seemed to have been rehearsed, but nothing, absolutely nothing, violated the law at the time. The most significant revelation of this period did not come from the inspections, but from an object found on the trail, just over 300 meters from the south fence. A piece of notes corroded by rain inside a broken glass that could have been part of a medicine bottle. The paper contained only 2 legible lines. "If I return before nightfall, we will talk in the meeting room. If I don't, tell them I accepted the settlement." There was no signature, but the handwriting was similar to that of one of the missing men, the 17-year-old boy. Decades later, the researcher confirmed that the writing style matched letters he had sent to his mother months earlier. This small note changed the course of the narrative, not because it proved anything conclusively, but because it implied that some men entered the binding chamber voluntarily, perhaps to negotiate, perhaps to settle debts, perhaps for something that was never explained. The word settlement became central to the historical interpretation of the case. Settlement of what? Of work? Of money? Of borders? Or of something more intimate and unmentionable? What is known is that, after the note was found, the community was divided. Some believed that the sisters were victims of coincidence, living isolated in a dangerous transit land. Others, those who left anonymous notes on the church door, believed that the Cold Peak sisters had some kind of arrangement with certain travelers, something that could have gotten out of control. The last confirmed revelation from that period came from a 1904 record, when the house was already empty. During the final cleaning of the site, one of the workers found, lying behind a loose board, a second iron key, almost identical to the one found by the sheriff years earlier. It was attached by a short piece of dark fabric, the same fabric used by the sisters on their wrists. On the board where the key was hidden, there was a circular pressure mark, indicating that something had been fitted there repeatedly. The report describes the mark with an enigmatic phrase. It looked like the mark of a lock, but what it locked was no longer there. From that point on, the Cold Peak sisters' case ceased to be just an investigation into disappearances and became a study of silence. The silence of the house, the silence of the community, The silence of the women who never defended themselves against direct accusations, but also never offered complete explanations. And what authorities discovered when they tried to track down the sisters' whereabouts in the following years would turn the mystery into something even deeper. When the county tried to locate the 4 women, none of them appeared in records of change of address, marriage, land purchase, or death. They simply ceased to appear in any documents after the end of 1901, as if, after the disappearances, it was their turn to disappear as well. There are cases that withstand the passage of time, not because of the amount of evidence, but because of the gaps that insist on remaining intact. The mystery of the Cold Peak Sisters, reviewed and revisited by historians, chroniclers, and researchers for over a century, has become less of a criminal file and more of a mirror of human silence itself, the kind that exists when simple questions find answers that never come. When the researcher responsible for reopening the case, now elderly, returned to the county for the last time in 1959, he found the old property overgrown with tall grass. The house was gone. All that remained was the worn alignment of stones that marked the outline of the foundation. The wind, which had previously barely blown through the hills, now whistled unhindered, as if time had decided to return sounds that no one had heard for decades. The investigator walked slowly across the land, following a yellowed copy of the old maps. He stopped where the door to the binding chamber should have been, trying to imagine the room as it had been described in the reports. The cold floor, the smell of iron, the marks that no one had been able to explain. There was nothing else there, only earth, roots, and the shadows of trees that had grown after the sisters left. In his final notes, written in shaky handwriting, he recorded something that was not included in the official reports. "I don't know what these women did, nor what they tried to protect. But there is a profound difference between guilt and silence. Some people remain silent because they have done something terrible. Others, because they keep something that could never be explained within the codes of the world around them." The community, for its part, learned to live with the case as one lives with an old scar, not denying its existence, but avoiding touching it directly. Some families repeated for generations that the men disappeared because they strayed too far from the group of travelers. Others believed that the trail was dangerous by nature and that 1901 was just a year of accumulated bad luck. And there were those who, even without evidence, were convinced that the sisters knew more than they revealed. The undeniable fact is that none of the 4 ever appeared in any document again. It is unlikely that they left the county without anyone noticing, especially in a region where every movement was noted, commented on, or observed. But there is also no record of their bodies, nor of any new property acquired, nor of any subsequent family ties. They disappeared as definitively as the men whose trail was lost on the trail. This symmetry, men who did not return, women who did not stay, became the core of the historical debate about Cold Peak. It is not a matter of imagining extraordinary actions, but of understanding how human decisions, made in silence, can shape the fate of dozens of people without leaving clear marks behind. Over the following decades, the archives were reorganized, files were lost, and newspapers deteriorated. But 2 iron keys survived the passage of time. One of them is kept in the small county museum. The other remained in the possession of the researcher, who kept it until his death. At the bottom of the drawer where he kept clippings, letters, and copies of testimonies, they found a note that was not included in the book he published, perhaps out of prudence, perhaps out of respect for the lives of all those involved. The note read, "Doors exist to separate what can be seen from what should not be said. But keys exist to remind us that someone, someday, made the decision to close." No subsequent document has been able to explain the weight of this sentence. No modern investigation has filled the gaps left by the summer of 1901. And in a way, perhaps that is precisely what keeps the shadow of the Cold Peak Sisters alive. The impossibility of determining with absolute certainty who was a victim, who was an accomplice, who was just an involuntary witness to a rural world that survived on codes as rigid as they were fragile. On the rare days when current researchers visit the site, they usually remain silent when they reach the mark of the old foundation. Even without walls, even without doors, the space seems to maintain a kind of invisible order, as if any false step could disrupt a story that no longer belongs to anyone. At the end of his last visit, the researcher slowly closed his notebook, rested his hand on the ground, and wrote his last sentence about the case. It was not a conclusion. It was merely an acknowledgement of what he and everyone else had never been able to overcome. The sentence read, "Some places remain closed long after they have lost their door," and after that he wrote nothing more.